I've been curious about the materials used in the blades of modern knives, so I started to do some research online. As I accumulated some results, the list became pretty long, and I posted them here on one of our websites, and you can see there's a lot of information. So I think the best way to get it across, the best way to present it, would be in a short video. Hopefully this will be informational, and it'll also act as a way for me to solicit some contributions or feedback from anybody who might be interested. If you'd like to follow along or take a look, we did post it at one of our sites, knifebuyersguide.com/metals, and that's plural with a capital M. Of course, the information will be available on the description of this video or in the blog or wherever you happen to find this content. So let's start as if someone had no familiarity with blade materials at all, which is basically where I was starting. The blades, for the most part, are going to be made out of steel. There are some exotic alternatives, which we'll mention at the end, but for the most part, blades are made out of steel. So what is steel? Steel is a combination of iron and carbon, and the percentage of carbon in the mix is what's going to give it its characteristics of hardness or softness and things like that. Other elements that are used, things like manganese and chromium, are also sometimes used in the production of steel. Something like chromium, for example, is going to lend a characteristic of corrosion resistance. So a steel with a high level or a high percentage of chromium is going to be more resistant to rust, for example, than a steel with less chromium. So the beginning of my research here, I just put some of the more common alloys or some of the common elements used in steel, and then the attributes that they give to the final result. Again, some of the alloys and their characteristics. So once we know how steel is made and the way that the ingredients are going to give us a final result, we have to organize all that. So that's done by grading the steel, and that's done by various organizations such as automotive engineers, societies for testing and materials, places that are going to give us a framework or a place to start from. However, if we just go there and ask them about steel, the options are overwhelming. So the way I started out my research, I'm going to scroll down to the bottom of the page here. I listed all the manufacturers. So for example, if you go to Benchmade, one of my favorite companies, you go to their website and they're going to give you a lot of information about the steels that they use. About a paragraph or more on each steel, its characteristics, why they chose to use it. We went through and did that for each of the companies that we could think of. Most of the bigger companies and most companies in general are going to talk about the steel that they use in their knives. Some of them even talk about the choices and why they chose the steels they did. So as you go through our results, what you're really looking at is a list of these steels, and in the left-hand column here, they're all the names of all these steels. They mostly have weird names like AUS 8 or 134 CM. So these are the names, and you can see that there's quite a few of them. So we had to try to break it down a little bit further if we could. Most people agree that you can divide steel between carbon steel and stainless steel. And the difference here is, again, that level of chromium. Chromium is one of the ingredients, and once you get to 11% chromium, it switches over to a stainless steel. So any steel with a chromium level of less than 11% would be considered carbon steel. Any steel with a chromium content of more than 11% would be considered stainless steel. And we're not going to get into the specifics, but basically that's what gives it a resilient outer protection from corrosion like rust. Typically speaking, your carbon steels are going to hold an edge better, are going to be easier to sharpen. However, a stainless steel is going to be impervious to corrosion, less maintenance, and once it has an edge, it's going to hold that edge longer, typically. Now, some of the newer steels, some of the newer metals are taking the positive characteristics of both sides and combining them into high-quality super steels. And that's really where the questions come up. So I've broken it down between the blue side, the carbon steels, and the green side, the stainless steels, and that's just a visual frame so that you can see where you are if you're scrolling up and down the list. So again, I started with the manufacturers, and for example, Cold Steel uses 1055. Ontario Steel mentions they use 1075, and that's where the list developed. Some of the steels are used by lots of companies. Something like D2, a very popular steel, is used by Benchmade, Kershaw, Microtech, Spyderco, SOG, and Ka-Bar. So in those cases, I highlighted the steel because it is a fairly common one used by a lot of companies, very popular steel. Included things like its ingredients, its alloys, the Rockwell hardness, and then we even used price from a couple of different sources: a steel company and a company that supplies materials to custom knife makers, to get some relative prices. So we compare, for example, a high-speed powdered crucible steel to a fairly common 440 steel and get a price on a 1 foot by 2 inch by 1/8 inch piece of steel. We also have some information on characteristics and just general information. For example, a neat one is 154 cm, which was actually developed for use in jet engines. So hopefully the results of the research here is interesting for people. Again, basically you're looking at the names of the steel down the sides and then information about the steel that you can use to compare them. Please feel free to give us some feedback. You can see there's lots of information that's missing. If you know something that we've left out, feel free to include it. We'd like this resource to grow over time and become something that is current that people can use to keep track of the different steels that are out there. So again, thanks for watching. Check out the results of the research and please feel free to contribute.